Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's class. We are following up on MiFID, and we're going to look at some of the most important conduct of business rules that apply in the MiFID context. As you are aware by now, MiFID is strongly oriented to reinforcing investor protection, and it has as its main target the retail client. So it contains rules that are designed to reinforce the protection of clients that do not have particular knowledge or expertise in the financial sector, which is what we will see again MiFID calls retail clients. And one of the main tools that it uses is the whole body of conduct of business rules that you find in the directive. Now, this is an area of MiFID legislation that grew in complexity and in size since its beginning in 1993. The first core of these conduct of business rules was, in fact, included in the ISD Investment Services Directive of 1993, and then over time, with the advent of MiFID I and then on MiFID II, it grew in complexity and in extension. So today it's a truly comprehensive and very analytical set of provisions that also has over time been applied on similar grounds in other areas of European financial legislation. There are several examples of this phenomenon, which is truly a case of MiFID standards circulating in other areas of European financial law. One of the most important one is insurance distribution. The second directive on the distribution of insurance products is truly based on MiFID standards for the protection of consumers of insurance products, but also in the credit and banking area, we have examples of MiFID standards being applied there. The Consumer Credit Directive and the Mortgage Credit Directive adopt in the context of lending to consumers standards which are taken out from the MiFID regime. Let's go back to the classification of clients. We already discussed this a little bit last time, and this slide sort of gives you a visual representation of how MiFID treats the classification of clients, and you see it's like a pyramid, and you have the three groups of clients that we already looked at: retail, professional, and eligible counterparties. And the level of expertise grows from the retail client to eligible counterparties, but the level of protection increases from eligible counterparties to retail clients. So the higher the expertise, the lower the level of protection, and vice versa. As I told you last time, MiFID does not give us a positive definition of what is a retail client, but rather we have to carve out this definition by including any client which is not a professional client. So we do have a positive definition of what is a professional client, but we do not have a positive definition of what is a retail client. A retail client is simply a client that under MiFID is not a professional. And eligible counterparties are a subset of professional clients. They include, as you see on the slide, financial institutions and such as investment firms, banks, insurance companies, asset management companies, and supervised entities that provide financial services on a professional basis. So you can say that eligible counterparties are a subtype of professional clients. The annex to MiFID gives us the criteria and also the definition, by the way, of what is a professional client. There is a general notion that you see on the slide. A professional client is a client that possesses the experience, knowledge, and experience to make its own investment decision and properly assess the risk that it incurs. And on the basis of this general definition, which clearly looks at the knowledge and expertise of a potential client in the context of investment services, we have two different kinds of professional clients. The first ones are the clients who are considered professional, let me say, on an automatic basis. We call them de facto professional clients. And there is a list of these de facto professional clients that includes eligible counterparties, obviously, and also large undertakings. There are certain parameters that ordinary corporations, which are not financial intermediaries, must comply with, and that since they would be large companies with shares that are listed on regulated markets, for instance, they would be considered as professional clients de facto. And then we have a second group of professional clients, which includes professional clients who ask to be treated as such. This would be retail clients, basically, who want to be upgraded to the level of professional clients. There are different reasons why a retail client might wish to be treated as a professional client. It's really something which is quite subjective, but basically, if you look at market reality, this is a consequence of two prevailing factors. The first is that the client might wish to acquire products which are available only for professionals. These might be, for instance, risky products, such as derivatives or complex financial instruments with high leverage levels, high risk profile, or even illiquid financial products. Now you see that on the market there is quite a strong tendency to offer to investors more long-term investment products, such as closed investment funds, private equity funds, venture capital funds, and these have a time horizon. These are products that have a time horizon which is more on the long side of the curve. And most of these would not really be accessible to retail clients. And the retail client might instead wish to buy one of those financial products, to invest in one of those categories, and in order to do so, he might request to be treated as a professional client. Another reason is that in some cases, services that are targeted to professional clients have different pricing vis-à-vis the ones that are instead targeted to retail clients. They might be less expensive and more suitable for even a retail client who carries on a significant amount of transactions, so he's sort of working on economies of scale. But regardless of the reasons that might lead a client to ask for the treatment, to be treated as a professional client, and therefore lose some of the protection that the MiFID conduct of business rules would otherwise provide, regardless of the reasons why the client is doing so, the fact is that MiFID considered this as a very delicate process that should be treated with utmost care. It is a delicate process because the danger is that the client is not fully aware of the consequences of being treated as a professional client rather than as a retail client. And it is also quite delicate because what MiFID wants to avoid is the risk that the client is actually induced or stimulated by the investment firm to ask for this particular classification. So the directive is quite comprehensive in trying to ensure that the client understands what he's doing and that this request is genuine and it is not driven, so to say, by the investment firm who is trying to sort of open up a wider category or range of products for that particular client or group of clients. And this is why we say that this second group of professional client, which is made up of non-professional market players, so this is not a bank, it's not an insurance company, it's not an asset manager, it's basically an individual or a private small corporation that asks for this different classification. This is why we say that these are professional clients on request, and the request really needs to be genuine, needs to be genuinely made by the client out of its own initiative. And nonetheless, even if this element is complied with and the request is truly genuine and it has not been stimulated or solicited by the investment firm, there are some criteria that in any case need to be complied with in order for this request to be considered and evaluated by the investment firm. You see, there are three criteria. These are set out in the slide. There are basically 2 out of 3 are quantitative criteria. The client needs to show that it has carried out at least 10 transactions per quarter over the past 12 months. And it must show that it has a portfolio of financial instruments of more than 500,000 euros. So these are quantitative criteria. And then you have a more qualitative criteria, which relates to the professional background and experience of the client that you are considering. So at least 2 out of these 3 criteria must be satisfied, and together with the fact that the request must be a genuine request coming up from the client. In any case, the investment firm, when it receives this request from the client, must always carry out its own individual assessment, and it must really be convinced on the basis of its own internal evaluation that the client is truly in a position to be considered as a professional client without any ambiguity, so to say. So the final word is upon the investment firm, and you see on the market that in many circumstances investment firms refuse, if they behave properly, if they apply these tests correctly, they sometimes or many times refuse to treat as professional a client that asks to be considered as such. And there's quite a high level of liability and duty of care implied in processing the request by a retail client to be treated as a professional client. Going back to the slide of the pyramid, so as you see, a retail client may ask to be classified as a professional, but bear in mind, I already told you this last time, but just to clarify again, that this is not allowed. Okay, so a retail client may not be classified as an eligible counterparty. This is considered as an excessive upgrade of the client because an eligible counterparty effectively loses all of the protection, practically all of the protection that is provided under MiFID conduct of business rules. Okay, in fact, this is the classification. Retail clients get the fullest and highest level of protection under MiFID. Professional clients are in an intermediate area. Eligible counterparties get the lower level of protection. And as I explained on Monday, things can work the other way around. So a professional client may ask to be treated as a retail client, and an eligible counterparty may ask to be treated as a professional client or even as a retail client. How frequent is this phenomenon of a professional that asks to be downgraded, or even an eligible counterparty who asks to be downgraded? It is quite frequent, actually. It's not something that is so rare to see on the market, and because professional clients often wish to be subject to a higher level of protection, even if maybe they get more expensive services, because naturally managing by an investment firm, managing a business for retail clients requires higher level of compliance with the legislation. So it is usually more expensive than the service which is provided to a professional client. One of the most frequent cases in which you see this downgrading of a client who asks to be treated as a retail client even though he is a professional is in the area of investment funds, pension funds, and similar categories. And if you think about it, this makes sense, because a fund manager actually manages the funds of its own clients. And if that fund manager has a fund which is open to retail investors, then most likely he would seek protection under MiFID legislation as a retail client, because he has retail investors, and therefore it makes sense that he asks to be protected as a retail client would be under the MiFID regime, so that you have a sort of a uniform standard of protection throughout the entire production chain. The fund is treated as a retail client because in its turn it has retail investors that are participants to the fund. Okay, now looking at the conduct of business rules under MiFID, we have a lot of very detailed provisions in level 1, in level 2, and also in the technical standards. But going through all of these provisions would be too much. It would require an excessive amount of time. So we have to look once again at the basic provisions that really make up the core of investor protection under MiFID. The first set of these provisions is undoubtedly the one on suitability and appropriateness. I would say that suitability and appropriateness are a sort of a trademark of the MiFID regime since the beginning, since the 1990s, and they are the typical standard of MiFID conduct of business rules. The common core of suitability and appropriateness is to provide investors with a tailor-made service. Tailor-made service means that investors should be offered and should invest in products and services that they understand, that are in line with their investment objectives, that comply with their level of risk tolerance, and they shouldn't be subject to cases of mis-selling of financial products. If you are an old gentleman who has retired, who doesn't have a very long lifetime expectancy, you would probably be more compliant with investing in products that do not have a very long term of duration of divestment. So the time frame of your investments should be more on the short side, or on the medium side at least. You would probably prefer to invest in not very risky and speculative products, because if something goes wrong and you lose your capital, you might not have the time to recover from those losses. And that's what basically suitability would try to capture, and appropriateness, to provide you with services as an investor that are really tailor-made in order to match your investor's profile. The two tests, or the two rules on suitability and appropriateness are basically based on this same approach, but they have a different scope of application and different mechanisms in terms of application. The scope is different because suitability only applies to investment advice and portfolio management services. I think you remember when I showed you right at the beginning of the MiFID introduction the list of investment services, and then I discussed what the different investment services are about. I had underlined in the list of investment services investment advice and portfolio management, and told you at that point that I had done so because these two services are the ones that are subject to the most comprehensive and intensive rules of investor protection under MiFID. And in fact, they are the two services that are subject to the suitability test. All the other services are instead subject to the appropriateness test, which works differently from suitability, as we will see. We also have, in the context of MiFID, services that are subject neither to the suitability nor to the appropriateness test. You clearly see this on the slide because these services, you see that suitability and appropriateness are barred, characters which are barred, so they would not apply in case of execution-only services if certain conditions are complied with. We will see in a few seconds what these execution-only services are about and how they work. So the suitability test is, as I told you, a test that looks at the profile of the client. The client needs to be understood, needs to be profiled by the investment firm. Colloquially, we refer to this activity as know your customer, as a phase of know your customer. You may have seen sometimes this acronym KYC. Know your customer. It is applied in other areas of financial legislation, not only in MiFID. For instance, KYC is a common acronym that you find in the context of anti-money laundering provisions, but it is surely widely used in the context of MiFID. So if you have to build and to make up a very bespoke and tailor-made clothes, if you're a tailor and you have to make that, you have to take measurements of your client, and you have to really make your suit has to really be made on a case-by-case basis, and by considering the specific body characteristic, weight, size of that particular client. This is what happens in MiFID. What the suitability test does is to take those measures of the client, and the MiFID gives us the criteria to do so. And the know your customer process looks at capturing information on the client as these four fundamental elements: knowledge and experience of the client, that needs to be assessed in the specific investment field relevant to the product or service which he is considering, his financial situation, including the client's ability to bear losses, and his investment objectives, including his risk tolerance. Okay, so this is a comprehensive assessment, and this assessment is carried out by market players through the compilation of questionnaires, which over time have become more and more complex and articulated. At the beginning, 30 years ago, when we had the first ISD directive, questionnaires were pretty simple. Today they are quite comprehensive. There has been a lot of refinement in market practice, also driven by supervisors that over time have issued guidelines and enforcement actions so that these questionnaires are effectively capable of capturing the profile of the client. And this is done on a preliminary basis before the client opens up a relationship with an investment firm, before accessing and executing a contract that provides investment advice or portfolio management. This is a preliminary step without which the service cannot be provided at all. The suitability assessment is therefore an assessment that is looking forward to capturing the capability of the client to understand the essential fact about the transaction. And therefore what you end up by doing is that you profile your client, and the result of this exercise would generally lead to the client being inserted into a specific category. On the basis of my experience, what I see on the market, the standard solution is that you have from 3 to 5 different categories of clients. The first group, clients in group 1, are the ones that have a lower risk profile, they have a lower capacity to bear losses, they have a financial situation which is not particularly important. And then as you move up the scale and you reach the last cluster of clients, for instance, number 5, but I mean, each investment firm can handle this process differently, so it might be that sometimes you end up with 3 clusters or with 10 clusters, but on an average basis it's from 3 to 5 clusters. The last cluster would instead include clients that are on the top sort of side of the curve, and they would be clients with a higher risk profile, with higher expectations in terms of return, and higher knowledge and experience and ability to bear losses. And in performing investment advice and portfolio management, the firm must always ensure that what it does complies with the client classification under the suitability test. So it needs to understand and to check that the transaction meets the investment objectives of the client, including risk tolerance, length of time, risk profile, and the purpose of the investment. It is such that the client is financially able to bear investment risks consistent with his investment objectives, and is such that the client has the necessary experience and knowledge in order to understand the risks involved in the transaction. You see on this slide there are some words in green, and these are there in order to clarify how these criteria are applied to professional clients. And this is an example of the modulation of the conduct of business rules that you find in MiFID when you differentiate retail clients to professional clients. And As you can see from the slide, which is basically taken out of Article 54 of Level 2 Regulation 565, as you see in the heading of the slide itself, the approach of MiFID is truly cherry-picking. What MiFID does in considering whether a certain provision is applicable or not to professional clients, as we know, professional clients are allowed and are granted a lower level of protection vis-à-vis retail clients. But in deciding how to apply this criteria, MiFID takes a very granular and precise approach. It doesn't simply say, for instance, in the suitability test, suitability does not apply to professional clients. It applies the test on a case-by-case basis to professional clients. So what we end up with is that even for professional clients, suitability test is necessary in the context of investment advice and portfolio management, but condition B is applicable only to professional clients upon request, and condition C instead is assumed to be satisfied for professional clients. So professional clients are subject to suitability with some exceptions. And this case-by-case approach, this cherry-picking by MiFID of each single provision designed for the purpose of investor protection, that is then applied differently to the various categories of clients, is a general characteristic of MiFID. And so if you are looking for an easy solution to the question, what is applicable to professional clients vis-à-vis retail clients? Unfortunately, this easy solution does not exist. You do not simply have a list of rules in MiFID that apply to professional or retail clients, but you have to cherry pick and consider each single provision and see how it is applicable to the single retail client. The difference with the appropriateness test, if you consider on the one side suitability and on the other appropriateness test, is first of all that the test of appropriateness applies to different services. So suitability comes up when investment advice or portfolio management are being provided. Appropriateness instead is applied to other investment services. And also the kind of information that is required is different because the appropriateness test is based on knowledge and experience of the client. There is no reference to the financial situation or the investment objective. So it's much simpler to apply, but the methodology is the same. You have a questionnaire and you capture certain information from the client, and then you consider whether that particular service product is appropriate for the client. The methodology is the same, but the amount of information embedded in the appropriateness test is reduced. Okay, so this is a slide that sort of recaps what I have been saying in relation to the application of suitability and appropriateness to professional clients, and so it's just a recap. There's nothing new in this. Now there is a lot of discussion there has been developing quite a lot of discussion in the context of the fintech phenomenon of having investment and financial services being provided through technological platforms, and in particular for investment services provided through internet and similar technological supports. There's been quite a lot of discussion as to how we should apply this suitability and appropriateness test in the context of robo-advice services. Robo-advice is a very wide expression. Comes up from market practice and market evolution, and it clearly reflects the tendency of providing investment advice and portfolio management through automated services. You see clients that are onboarded through automated systems, and that they are subject to the MiFID questionnaire, not through an individual interaction as it used to be traditionally. Traditionally, the MiFID questionnaire was filled up by the client with the material assistance of employees of the investment firm. But now there is a strong tendency in the context of fintech of handling this process through big data, automatic client profile systems. And the question is whether we should in some way change or adapt MiFID rules in order to address what's happening in the case of robo-advice. The points of discussion revolve around different topics. For instance, when the client is onboarded in a robo-advice environment, he is more or less left by himself in providing this information, in filling up the questionnaire, and this may imply behavioral biases that are well known in the context of tech phenomenon. The client may over-evaluate his experience, may overestimate his capacity to bear losses, may overestimate his risk attitude. And if he is simply in front of a computer and needs to fill up a questionnaire, he might not have the assistance which is provided by an individual in a traditional way of interaction, and may ultimately end up by making wrong choices. So that's one point. The second point is that in fintech phenomenon, the role of algorithmic profilation, the role of technology in processing the information, collecting and processing the information of the client becomes paramount, because in a pure, complete robo-advice services, everything is done by the machine, and there is no human individual interaction. So the question has come up as to whether we should imagine of amending MiFID rules and sort of draft a specific bespoke set of regulations for robo-advice, because the context is so different from the one that was originally considered by investment services legislation. And as of today, the response which has been provided to this question is negative. Regulators all across Europe think that MiFID rules are sufficiently flexible in order to address these new phenomena. We do not need to have specific rules that apply to the robo-advice world, but we need to stress, and this is what Article 54 of the delegated regulation says, and we need to stress the fact that regardless of the way through which the service is provided, whether it is a traditional service or it is a fintech service, the ultimate responsibility to ensure that the suitability assessment is appropriately carried out lies upon the investment firm. And this is what you see on the slide. This is what Article 54 says, that it is up to the investment firm to ensure that the process, whether automated or semi-automated or not, is solid and does not have a negative impact on the protection of investor. So the investment firm must ensure, for instance, that the algorithm and that the process for the compiling of the questionnaire and for collecting information from the client is solid, it works properly, and that the algorithm is built in a way which ensures compliance with the principles that we are considering. At that point, whether it is a human individual that assists the clients or whether it's a machine that picks up the information and processes them for the clients know your customer process is truly not relevant. What is important is that the architecture works properly, and that the investment firm acknowledges that it is its responsibility to ensure that this objective is effectively achieved. Some, however, think there are proposals on the table which are being discussed. Some think that in the context of robo-advice, the algorithm that's used for profiling clients should be disclosed to the clients, so that when you access robo-advice on a platform, you have, as a client, sufficient knowledge of how your data will be processed and considered. And according to some, this is appropriate because it would raise awareness by the client as to how his information is effectively treated, and may make him more sort of aware also at the same time as to the type of information that he is providing and are being used. However, many think that this is not a good idea and it should not be pursued at all for different reasons. The first is that algorithms are very complex things, and each investment firm that uses robo-advice has its own algorithms. They all need to be compliant with MiFID standards, but each firm has its own internal algorithms and procedures. And building up an algorithm for the purpose of profiling clients is very expensive. It involves a lot of investments, and it is really, trade secret. It's part of the trade secrets, and like a patent, that it is not appropriate to destroy by forcing the algorithm to become public. And that's one argument. The second argument is that even if the algorithm were made available to the customer when it accesses robo-advice services, it is most likely the client would really get any additional protection, because what he would see would be basically, unless he is an expert in computer science, he would see a list of incomprehensible formula and the fact that he gets all this information very technically would not really add a lot to his protection and understanding of how. So it is better that we sort of keep things as they are, but that we stress the liability, as Article 4 of the Regulation 565 does. We stress and we shift all of the liability on the management of this information to the on the shoulders of the investment firm. The difference between suitability and appropriateness is, on the one side, in terms of the kind of services to which these tests apply: suitability, investment advice, and portfolio management; appropriateness, all the other tests. But also, and that's the first difference. The second difference is in terms of outcome of these two tests, because if the outcome is negative, so if a certain transaction is not suitable or appropriate, there is a huge difference between suitability and appropriateness. Under the suitability test, as you see from the slide, the investment firm is prevented from recommending the investment services or carrying out the transaction. So we generally say, in colloquial terms, that suitability is blocking. If it is negative, the outcome of the test is negative, the transaction cannot really be carried out. And there is nothing that the investment firm in principle can do in order to sort of overcome this obstacle, which is absolute. Instead, if the negative outcome concerns the appropriateness test, what the client gets is a warning. He would get a warning with which the firm would tell him, beware, this transaction is not appropriate, but the client may nonetheless decide to proceed. So he is in a position where he might confirm that he wants to go ahead, and at that point the transaction would be executed. So suitability is blocking in case of negative outcome. It is not blocking in terms of negative outcome. Appropriateness is not blocking in terms if you get a negative outcome. Okay, and this is very important. So you have different services: suitability, appropriateness, blocking, non-blocking. Okay, I assume this is clear enough. Just give me, please, 15 seconds. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about this. Now let's take a look. I think this is interesting because we under MiFID we has quite a comprehensive set of Q&As that you find on ESMA's website. And by the way, on ESMA's website you find a lot of information on suitability and appropriateness, guidelines, different levels of guidelines, and also Q&As, various Q&As. And it's interesting to look at what we have in question 6, because really question 6 and the answers provided to question 6 of the Q&A give you an idea of how this mechanism of blocking, non-blocking suitability test actually works. So the question that was submitted to ESMA was pretty straightforward. Somebody asked, what Q&As by ESMA work in a very flexible way. Anybody can ask a question to ESMA, and if ESMA thinks that the question is properly raised and deserves to be answered, a public statement will provide its answer in the Q&As section, which is updated on a periodical basis. So the question in this case was, what are the obligations on a firm when a specific financial instrument is unsuitable for a client, when the client wishes to proceed with the transaction nonetheless? So it seems a contradictory question, because I just told you that suitability, if the negative is negative, is blocking, and the client cannot truly proceed with the transaction. But what happens if the client insists, or if there are are there any ways through which this prohibition can be sort of overcome? Now, ESMA gives us 3 examples. They are all very interesting to look at. Let's look at example number 1. The case is the following. Client A has an ongoing relationship with firm X for the provision of investment services, including investment advice. So we are in the context of suitability, investment advice. Firm X has an actual relationship with a third party, company Z, for selling products issued by company Z itself. Client A would like to make an investment and, in the context of his relationship with firm X, asks for an advice from the firm. The firm, knowing that the investment in those products would be unsuitable for client B, deliberately raises his profile, although no changes in the client's situations that would justify such a change have effectively occurred, so as to be able to recommend them. This is clearly in breach of MiFID rules. Okay? What's happening here is that the profile of the client, which was the original input of the KYC assessment, is being upgraded, even if there are no changes in the information that the client provided, in order to open up the access to a wider range of products which would otherwise be unavailable because of a negative suitability test. And this is something that is unacceptable for MiFID product. Now, you may be sort of surprised that these questions come up in the ESMA Q&A's context, but in fact, it is something that we have seen, unfortunately, happen many, many times. We have seen in all across Europe cases of severe mis-selling of financial products that were backed up by a manipulation of the MiFID suitability assessment, including cases like this, reprofiling clients in order to raise their investment profile so as to open up for commercial reasons and typically commercial reasons to open up a wider range of products that would otherwise not be accessible to the client. Another case, which is again in contrast with the suitability requirements of MiFID and that we have seen happen many, many times. This is a case particularly famous in Italy because we've had really a massive phenomenon of mis-selling of subordinated bank bonds, obbligazioni subordinate, by banks that were desperately in need of raising new funds and that then went into resolution or similar procedures under national law. At that point, the bonds that had sold to retail clients, mis-sold to retail clients, were subject to bail-in, and the clients lost all of their investment. So there was, we've had a lot of problems in Italy, not just in Italy, all across Europe with these cases of mis-selling, especially of subordinated bank bonds. So let's look at the case. Client B has an ongoing relationship with firm Y for the provision of investment, so it's including investment advice. So we are always in the context of investment advice. Firm Y is also the issuer of product Y and has a specific interest in placing it in order to meet its funding needs. So this is typically what happens when the bank issues bonds which are offered to its own customers. In the context of the relationship with client B, the firm, being aware that product Y would not be suitable given the client's financial situation, their investment objectives, and their knowledge and experience, decides to influence him to buy product Y at his own initiative, for example, by emphasizing all possible advantages of such an investment. As a consequence, the client executes the transaction under the appropriateness test or execution only, without the protections afforded by the suitability assessment. Clearly, again, this is not allowed by MiFID. Formally, what you see at a certain point is that the client executes the transaction in a context which is not investment advice, because he decides that he is deciding by himself to buy that product, but in fact he has been sort of stimulated by the investment firm to do so. The investment firm did not provide a recommendation it could not provide a recommendation because the product was not suitable, but in any case, it is sort of emphasizing the advantages of such an investment in a different context. So what you would see is that formally you are in the appropriateness test area, and it's the client that decides to carry on the transaction, but this is a case which is not compliant with MiFID, and the huge cases of mis-selling of subordinated bonds that we have seen over the past years were most of the times falling into this description that ESMA provides in this case. Now let's take a look at a different situation, which in differently from the ones that we saw before, is okay with MiFID standards. Client C has an ongoing relationship with firm W for the provision of investment services, including investment advice. In the context of this relationship, client C contacts the firm at its own initiative, asking its advice about what investment he should choose between product A and product B. The firm, that does not have any specific interest in selling either of the mentioned products, undertakes a suitability test and assessment, and ends up by seeing that only the investment in product B is suitable for client C. But despite the firm recommendation, the client insists in wanting to buy product A. Client C will therefore execute the transaction under the appropriateness test. So he would sort of opt out the investment advice and execute the transaction under a reception transmission of orders or execution of orders at his own risk or eventually in execution only, despite the firm's advice not to buy product A. This is okay. Now clearly the difference between this case and the one that we saw before lies in the fact that in this situation, the firm has clearly advised the client not to proceed with the transaction because it was not suitable. But at that point, the client, after having received that advice, closes the investment advice phase of the investment with the investment firm and then executes the transaction under a reception and transmission of orders. So this is okay because differently from the case before, the firm has formally advised the client against that, that investment. But ultimately, clients are always free to decide by themselves, but in a different context. At that point, the client would execute the order in a reception and transmission of orders or dealing service provided by the investment firm, and that would be under the appropriateness test. Most likely the system and the firm would nonetheless warn the client under the appropriateness test that the transaction is not appropriate, because if it was not suitable, it is most likely that it is not even appropriate. But at that point, the client, after the warning, may nonetheless proceed at his own initiative to execute the transaction. Okay, so I think that the distinction between case 2 and case 3 is clear. It is subtle, but it does make a difference, because in case 3, the investment firm has behaved properly by clearly providing a negative advice to the client, which has not been done at all in the slide that we saw before. Also, MiFID recalls in its Q&As that all that we've been seeing in terms of collecting information from the clients, a suitability assessment has to be recorded constantly by the investment firm, and it must be strongly sort of set out in internal procedures, and all the information needs to be stored appropriately. MiFID II also clarified that a suitability test, a full suitability test, must be carried out even when the advice concerns switching investments. Now, switching, as you see from what you read on the slide, is a situation where the client already owns a certain product and wants to divest from that product and invest into a new different product. So this is called switching. And commercially, switching is a very sort of active business because it generates commissions, and also there might be a strong tendency to induce clients to switch from one product to the other, because, for instance, the second product, the new product, has higher commissions. So there might be an incentive, and the client might be induced to switch, but without any particular benefit for the client. But the benefit might be for the investment firm that in the new product would get higher commissions as compared to the ones that were applicable in the original product. So switching is a very delicate area. There's a strong commercial pressure that the client may be subject to when he is sort of stimulated in buying, switching a new product, from switching to an old product into a new product. And MiFID is very much concerned about this mechanism, and we've had new standards and new indications by ESMA as to how the suitability assessment needs always to be complied with in the context of switching. In MiFID 1, switching was not so, let's say, under the limelight of the suitability assessment, but this is an area where MiFID 2 has clarified the scope of the suitability assessment much more clearly than what we had before. Now, I told you at the beginning of this discussion on suitability assessment that in certain conditions we have what we call execution-only services. These are activities that are not subject neither to suitability nor to appropriateness. And this is what you see on slide 21. And as you can read, if you are in the context of execution and reception of orders, or execution, executing orders coming from clients, or reception and transmission of orders. So you have to have one of these two services, either executing orders on behalf of clients or reception and transmission of orders. This could be a case where you can disapply. Well, suitability is disapplied because it's not investment advice or portfolio management, so that's pretty straightforward. But you can even disapply appropriateness when further conditions are met. Now, the most important one is the one that you see in the first paragraph. This one is the most important one, because you can disapply appropriateness particularly when the transaction refers to some specific financial instruments. And MiFID gives you a list. And we say that, just to simplify something which turns out to be a little bit tricky, we say that these are plain vanilla, non-complex financial instruments. And MiFID gives you a list, which includes, first of all, shares admitted to trading on regulated markets, bonds, UCITS, and then there is a complex level which is left to technical standards, which is other non-complex financial instruments. Okay. Now, I don't want you to get involved into the definition of other non-complex financial instruments. This is actually left to implementing technical standards that have been put in place, and it's far beyond the level of details that I would like you to reach. So just keep in mind that execution-only services can actually exist when it comes to executing orders and or reception and transmission of orders for plain vanilla, non-complex financial instruments. Now, the natural environment where you find this kind of situation is online trading platforms. That's typically the area where all across Europe you see that these execution-only activities are effectively in place, because that is a context where, you know, automatic trading can occur. The client is there in front of his PC, his computer, transmits the order, and in order to proceed, he is not subject to the appropriateness test at all. This might be useful because since execution-only activities are excluded from the appropriateness test, these are services which are less expensive. The commissions that are applied for these services are lower because the level of compliance that the investment firm needs to carry on is lower than the one that applies in the context of the appropriateness procedure. So services are discounted when you have execution-only services, and transactions are processed immediately with no need to verify whether they are appropriate or not, and eventually to send out the alert to the client. So the typical world where you see these execution-only activities is truly online trading and internet platforms that are effectively quite common. Okay, so suitability assessment, really that's the core, most important form of investor protection that MiFID, that the MiFID regime ensures. And it is also one of the big standards that are circulating outside the perimeter of MiFID, invading insurance distribution, also credit facilities such as mortgages, consumer credit, and other areas of European financial legislation. The second bulk of conduct of business rules that you find in MiFID is about the so-called best execution regime, which is introduced by Article 27 of the directive. Best execution, i.e., best execution means duty to execute orders on terms most favorable to the client. Okay, so in executing an order, investment firms, as a principle for retail clients, must ensure that they execute the order at the best available conditions. And how do you define the best available conditions? Well, Article 27 tells us you have to take into account the overall cost of the transaction and other factors such as speed, likelihood of execution, settlement, and size. And this is quite interesting because in the world of MiFID, we have, as we will see later on, different trading venues, different places where the transaction can be executed. You have regulated markets, you have MTFs, you have systematic internalizers, and you have over-the-counter as well, which may be a place where you find sufficient liquidity and good prices as well. So how should a broker, an investment firm providing execution of orders, for instance, how should it decide which trading venue to choose? The answer is quite simple. Article 27 says you have to choose the best one. And so what investment firms need to do is to carry out a periodical assessment as to the conditions that are available for execution on different trading venues, and ultimately identify the trading venues that they think would offer the best conditions for the client. And this is done through the drafting of an execution policy, which needs to be regularly updated, that would identify for different kinds of securities, different classes of securities, the trading venues that, according to the investment firm, would actually allow for the best execution rule to be complied with. So this is the second sort of it's much more articulated than what I am explaining, but this is sufficient for my purpose, that you know that you have suitability and appropriateness, then a best execution regime, and this is the second sort of cornerstone of conduct of business rules protection under the MiFID regime. Now, this best execution policy applies to retail clients, but also might apply to professional clients if they ask for additional protection. And it can be quite comprehensive, or it might be more specific. For instance, you can have distinct execution policies for different kinds of financial instruments, because different financial instruments have different trading venues, and then you can have more tailored execution policies for different kinds of financial instruments. And ultimately, the client may always indicate to the firm the trading venue where it wishes its order to be executed. So the client has the option of opting out from the general execution policy and ask for the transaction to be carried out on a specific trading venue. Eligible counterparties. We have already talked about this, so I will skip this slide. And let's move to another topic. If we were to really address this topic in full, we would probably require 2 lessons just on this. But once again, basic facts and basic principles, conduct of business rules, suitability, appropriateness, best execution, and then a whole bunch of rules that concern information, transparency towards clients. And this is pretty intuitive. Obviously, one of the typical techniques through which you protect clients in the context of MiFID is to provide information to investors. And so you find a lot of provisions in MiFID on information that comes before the service is provided, information that goes to the client during the execution of the service, information that goes to the client after the service is provided, information that concerns the contract, information that concerns costs and execution venues. So it's under the general scope of Article 24, and then you have other articles that come after 24 in MiFID, but you have all of these set of very detailed provisions on transparency. One of the most innovative parts of this disclosure of information to the client that came up with MiFID II concerns the costs of the services. This is why I am circling this word in blue, because effectively the idea that clients must always have full transparency on the costs of the service has always been an idea in the context of investment services legislation since the directive of 1993. But effectively, MiFID has really sort of introduced new standards for this kind of transparency in relation to costs, and it now requires that clients are truly fully informed about all costs that are embedded or involved in the provision of investment services. And this is has been a matter of great concern for the industry, because before MiFID II, there were a lot of costs which still remained, so to say, under the carpet, were not fully legible and understandable by the client. Think, for example, of a situation where you have portfolio management. And in the portfolio management, you include in the portfolio units of investment funds. And maybe some of these funds are funds of funds. So you have portfolio management, inside the portfolio of the client units of investment funds, but these investment funds are in turn funds of funds. So you have different layers of commissions that would sort of top up and contribute to the overall cost of the service by the client. Before MiFID II, there was not much transparency in this respect, and the client might not really didn't have the full final figure of what is the total amount of the costs embedded in its portfolio management. It may have had sufficient transparency as to the commission applied by the portfolio management, but if you want to understand how expensive the service is, you really need to, in my example, to add up all the components of the different layers. Now MiFID II forces investment firms to provide a full transparency in all respect, and this has been quite difficult for the industry to accept, but ultimately this is what we have. So I must say that regardless of the fact that MiFID in this area is very, very, very detailed and also, allow me to say, a little bit boring to read, but we have ended up with a level of transparency for costs applied to client which is significantly higher than the one that existed before MiFID II. Another important area where MiFID has come up with a new approach is the distinction between normal investment advice and independent investment advice. This distinction is important because if you look at investment advice from the perspective of the client, it is important for the client to understand whether the advisor that he is using is truly independent or not. But what do I mean by independent? Well, independency may be compromised by different factors. For example, the investment advisor might really be an advisor that is part of a group, of a financial group, and he is advising on the products of the group. He is not advising on third-party products. And that's something that limits the independency of the advisor. I'm not saying, nor MiFID is saying, that this is per se negative. It is not that necessarily all investment advisors must be in a position so as to advise on any possible product on the market. Market structures are different, and investment advice may be perfectly fine, even if it is limited to a range of products, such as, for instance, products of the group for which the investment advice is working. An investment advisor that is part of the UniCredit group, there's nothing bad in saying that he's providing advice on the products of the group, of UniCredit group. These are products that he knows very well. He has a lot of information on those products, and that's the area where he provides investment advice. But the idea of MiFID is to clarify the status of the investment advisor vis-a-vis the client, so that the client does not get the impression that he has in front an independent advice, when in fact the advice is not independent. So the advice might not be independent because of what I just explained. That's just one case, but there are many other situations that may impair the independency of an investment advisor. Another example I can give you is when the advisor gets commissions, gets paid by the product companies, and these would be called inducements. He receives inducement from the product companies that would lead him to recommend, might lead him to recommend one product instead of another, because on that product he gets commissions, but on the other product he doesn't. And this is something that sort of compromises independency in providing advice. So MiFID has introduced two sets of different regimes applicable to investment advice. One would apply to independent, and the other would apply to non-independent advice. And one of the core provisions is, first of all, the duty of the investment advisor to clearly say whether the advice is provided on an independent basis or not, so that the client is aware of the situation that he is facing. Also, investment advisors must clarify whether the range of products that they are advising upon is more or less limited, such as limited to financial instruments issued or provided by entities that have close relationship with the advisor. And independent advice, on the other side, requires that the advisor to consider and assess a sufficient range of financial instruments. This is a prerequisite for an investment advisor to be effectively considered as independent. Also, in the context of investment advice, the advisor must clarify whether the advice that he is providing is on a one-shot basis or whether it will turn out to be a periodic assessment of the suitability of the client. And this must be clarified, as you see in the slide, in the contract with the client. And most importantly, if an advisor stands out to be independent, he cannot receive any inducement except minor non-monetary benefits, but it's really a very narrow exception. In principle, an independent advisor may not get any inducement, and inducement means commissions paid by the companies whose products he is advising upon. So this is entirely prohibited for investment advisors. So MiFID gives you two different models through which investment advice can be provided, and the expectation that many member states, including the UK before Brexit, had on MiFID II is that MiFID II would have stimulated an increasing amount of independent investment advice. Because that's clearly, you know, the best solution for the client would effectively to be in a situation where the advisor is independent and considers a wide range of products. But this on the market has not happened, and we still have non-independent investment advice as probably the prevailing business model, at least on continental Europe. And so MiFID sort of leaves the two options on the table. And it will be clients that ultimately will decide what to do with the two different options that they might find on the market. It might be that things go on as they are. And in Italy, I have a big expectation that we will have a prevailing component of non-independent investment advice, even in the future, but we'll see what happens. So just at the end of today, let's look at the last pillar for today for conduct of business rules, which is product governance. Okay? Product governance is a new concept of MiFID II. It has been introduced in order to prevent the possible manipulations of suitability and appropriateness that we have clearly seen some of them in the Q&As of ESMA. And the idea is that, therefore, since suitability applies and appropriateness apply only when the client actually decides to invest, it's the last part of the distribution phase, something might go wrong. So you have to try and prevent that mis-selling occurs in that particular stage. Let me make you an example. Suppose that you have a producer of a very poisonous substance, a very dangerous poison, and that needs to be, it's a substance that needs to be handled with great care. And suppose that that substance ends up on the shelves of a supermarket, which is open to access for everybody. Now, there might be rules in the supermarket that say that product cannot be sold to people who are under 18. When they go to the cashier to pay for that bottle of poison, they must prove that they have a certain experience. But things might go wrong because you are really at the end of the distribution phase. So what you should do in order to avoid risks for consumers is really to prevent that product from being on the shelves of that supermarket. And that poison should instead be distributed through different distribution channels. This is what you have in the product governance context. And this has been introduced by MiFID II. And it turns out to be, again, a very comprehensive set of provisions that require that investment firms identify for each product that they put on the market the target market that they want to address. And this is a preliminary exercise. So you would have different products for different target markets. And then once the products are on those markets, then you would nonetheless apply suitability or appropriateness on an individual basis. It's a comprehensive new set of rules that also has you have a description of how these things work in the slides, but we have also a couple of group presentations on these topics, so we might go back and understand better how this thing works. But for my purpose, what you see in the slide is sufficient. But be careful that at the end of the slide you have, this part, which refers to ESMA's powers in the field of product intervention, because this is entirely new under MiFID. And this is basically a provision under MiFID that gives to supervisors the power to block certain products and exclude them from the market for the purpose of investor protection. So it's much stronger than product governance. It's called product intervention because in particular circumstances, supervisors might step in and say simply that a certain product should not be on the market at all. This is limited to retail clients, and it has been used already, for instance, in relation to certain binary option, very risky products, and contracts for differences with a high level of leverage. These products have been blocked from the market. These measures of product intervention are very, very tough. They can be temporary or they can be permanent, depending on allocation of powers between ESMA and ESAs. I don't want you to be bothered about that, but keep in mind that product governance has its extreme manifestation in the product intervention environment, where supervisors can step in and simply say these products cannot be on the market for retail investors. It's pretty strong, and it's a measure that comes up after the financial crisis, and it's been sort of stimulated by the mis-selling cases that we have seen occur in all member states in the context of the financial crisis of 2008. Okay, so next class will be 22nd of March. I have no idea whether it will be in presence or online, but if I read correctly that Lombardy is unfortunately sliding into the red zone, it is most likely that we still have to be online on the 22nd. And on the 22nd, we also have the first group presentations, okay? So I will organize the lesson by speaking for 15 minutes, then group 1, 15 minutes, 15 minutes of lesson, 15 minutes of group presentation until the end. If I am in class, I will handle this in class. Otherwise, we'll handle this online on the 22nd. Okay, any questions? Okay, have a good day. Bye-bye. Cheers.